Promised to a trapper twice her age, a Lakota chief rode in the night and stole her back. The horse was still sweating when I got back to camp. I remember looking at her neck, the way the black hair was dark and matted under the blanket I'd thrown over her. And I thought, she ran hard. She ran because I asked her to. And she gave me everything she had. And that is more than most men can say about the people who ride with them. I tied her off and stood there a minute in the dark. The fire was low. Most of the camp was sleeping, or at least lying still, which is close enough to sleeping when you are old enough to know the difference. My hands were still cold from the ride. I had not eaten since morning. None of that mattered yet. What mattered was the woman in the lodge behind me. I will tell you this the way it happened, which means I am going to tell you some things that don't show me well, and some things I am still not sure I understand, and one or two things I have never told anyone. That is the only way I know how to tell it. My name, the name my father gave me, means something in our language that translates badly into English, so I will not try. The traders called me Stone Hand. My people called me by something else, something quieter. I was 43 years old that winter, and I had been a chief for 11 years, and I was tired in the way a man gets tired when he has been responsible for other people's lives for a long time without anyone being responsible for his. My wife had been gone 4 years. Her name was Falling Branch, and I will not say much about her here because what I want to say would take too long, and this is not that story. What I will say is that she was good, and that when she died, a piece of me went into the ground with her that I did not expect to ever get back. You go on. You have to. There are children in the camp, and old people who need meat in the winter, and young men who need someone to hold the line when they want to do something stupid. You go on because there is no alternative. And after a while, the going on becomes the thing, becomes the whole shape of your life, and you stop expecting anything else. That was where I was when this began. It started with Tall Crane coming to my fire on an evening in late October. Tall Crane was one of the older men in camp, a decent man, a man who had never caused me trouble. He had a daughter named Wikapi, which means star, or something like a star, a light in the sky that has a name. She was 21 years old. I had known her since she was a child running between the lodges, and she had grown into a serious young woman, capable, a good rider, someone who could work all day and still have her mind working at the end of it. I noticed these things the way you notice things you are not supposed to need. He sat down across from me and I gave him food, and we talked for a while about nothing important. And then he told me. He had made an arrangement with a man named Harlan Pruitt. I knew Pruitt by name. Most people along that stretch of the river knew him by name. He had been trapping in the territory for 20 years, maybe more. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, with a beard that went gray somewhere in the middle of his face and then dark again at the ends, which always struck me as a strange thing. He traded skins and sometimes horses. He was not a violent man. Exactly, not the kind who started things. But he was the kind who finished them, in ways that left you feeling worse than before. He was, Tall Crane told me carefully, 46 years old. Wikapi was 21. Tall Crane explained it the way these things are sometimes explained, which is with a lot of words arranged around the real thing, so that the real thing doesn't have to be looked at directly. Pruitt had come to him. Pruitt had offered horses. Good horses, he said, and blankets, and a rifle, and certain things that the camp needed going into winter. It was a practical arrangement. It had been done before. I sat there and listened to all of it, and when he was finished I said, "Does she want this?" Tall Crane looked at the fire. I said, "Does she want this, Tall Crane?" He said she understood the necessity of it. "That is not what I asked," I said. He didn't answer. I told him I would think on it. That night I lay awake for a long time in my lodge, staring at the place in the smoke hole where you could see 3 stars when the clouds moved. And I thought about necessity, and what it costs, and who pays it. Wikapi came to get water from the creek 2 mornings later, and I was there watering my horse. It was early, the sun was not yet up. Just the gray light coming over the hills, and she stopped when she saw me. And I thought she was going to go back. But she didn't. She came down to the bank and started filling her vessel, and I stood there and held my horse's lead and tried to think of something worth saying. She spoke first. She said, "You know about Pruitt." I said I did. She looked at the water. Her face was, I don't know how to put this without making it sound like something it wasn't. She was not crying. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily. What I saw in her face was something more like a person making the calculation of what they are going to have to survive. You see that look in people who have been in hard country long enough. It is not despair. Despair is its own thing. This was something colder. This was a woman deciding that she was going to get through it. That was the thing that stayed with me. Not that she was unhappy. Not that she was frightened. Though she probably was both of those things and hiding them. What I kept turning over in my mind, riding out that afternoon, sitting at my fire that night, was that look of cold calculation. A young woman deciding what she could survive. I did not sleep well for several nights after that. The handoff was set for the first week of November. Pruitt came into camp with 2 of his men and a string of 5 horses. They were decent animals. I will give him that. He was practical about the things he wanted, and practical about what he paid for them. He walked through camp like he owned the ground he was standing on, the way certain men do in places where they have done business before and not been challenged. I watched from a distance. I had no reason to be there, and so I stayed away, which is what a chief does when something is happening that he does not have authority to stop, but that he cannot bring himself to watch. He left with her that afternoon. I heard the horses going. I was sitting in my lodge with the flap down, and I heard the sound of them moving out, and I counted the hoofbeats the way you count things when you are trying not to think about them. And then the sound was gone. I sat there for a while after that. Then I got up and went to see my horse. I want to be clear about something. I did not go after her because I loved her. That is not, I did not know that yet. What I knew was what I had seen on her face at the creek, and what I knew about Harlan Pruitt, and what I knew about the kind of life a young woman spends when she is handed to a man who sees her as part of a practical arrangement. I went after her because she was one of my people. That is what I told myself. I saddled my best horse, not the black one, the one I'd been pushing lately, but my gray, who was rested and steady, and I took my rifle and my knife, and I told no one where I was going. A chief who tells his camp he is riding out in the night to take back a woman from a trapper is a chief who has either lost his mind or has to answer for it afterward, and I didn't have time for either one. I knew roughly where Pruitt's winter camp was. He had a place on the bend of the river, 3 hours' ride east. The traders talked about it. There was a cabin, or something like a cabin, walls and a roof, which is more than some men had out there. He wintered there most years, and then moved on in spring. I rode in the dark. There was enough moon to see by, just enough. And the ground was hard, with the first freeze, so the gray's hooves were loud in a way I didn't like. I slowed her down when I got close and came up through the trees along the riverbank, and I sat there for a while and watched the light in the cabin window. There was a fire inside. One of his men was outside by a small fire of his own. Not really watching anything. More, staying warm, than keeping guard. He had a blanket over his shoulders and his chin was going toward his chest. I went wide around him. The door of the cabin was wood, rough cut, hung on leather hinges. I listened at it for a moment. I could hear Pruitt's voice inside, and one of his other men, talking about something, a river crossing they'd made. The trouble with one of the horses. I could not hear her. I will not tell you I was not afraid. I was. Not the kind of afraid that makes you run, the other kind. The kind that makes everything sharper. Makes you feel the weight of your knife on your hip and the sound of your own breathing. I lifted the latch and opened the door. Pruitt was sitting at a table with a tin cup in his hand. The other man, younger, thin, with a mustache that didn't suit him, was sitting near the fire. They both looked up. Wikapi was in the back of the cabin. She was sitting on a blanket on the floor, and when the door opened, she went very still. And then she saw me, and something in her face changed. Not relief exactly. Something more careful than relief. Like a woman recalculating her situation. Pruitt looked at me for a long moment. Then he said my name, or the name the traders used for me, Stone Hand, and he said it the way a man says a name when he is deciding something. I told him I was taking the woman back. He said he had an arrangement with her father. I told him the arrangement was done. He looked at me. He looked at his man by the fire. His man by the fire was looking at the rifle I was holding, which I had not pointed at anything. I was just holding it. Sometimes, that is enough. Pruitt set his cup down slowly. He was a practical man. I said that already, but I want to say it again because it is the reason things went the way they went. He looked at the rifle. He looked at me. He made his calculation. He said, "You're going to make this trouble for yourself with her father." I said, "That's my business." He said, "I paid good horses." I said, "I'll send you horses." That was not something I had planned to say. I don't know where it came from, but I said it, and I meant it. And Pruitt heard that I meant it. And that was what shifted the thing. He was not a man who could be shamed, exactly, but he was a man who understood value, and fair value. And I was offering him a way out that kept his horses coming and didn't require anyone to die. He picked up his cup again and looked at the fire. He said, "2 horses. Good ones." I said, "2 horses." He said, "Go on." Then, she walked out past him without looking at him, and I came out behind her, and we walked to where my gray was tied at the tree line. The man outside by the small fire watched us go. He didn't move. I gave her a hand up onto the gray, and then swung up behind her, and we rode. We didn't talk for a while. The moon was higher now, and the world was blue-white and cold, and I could feel the warmth of her through the blanket she had around her shoulders, and I kept my eyes on the trail ahead of us. After a while, she said, "Why did you come?" I said, "You're one of my people." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Just that?" I didn't answer. The gray moved under us, steady and even, and the river was somewhere off to our left, and I could hear it, but not see it in the dark. She said, "My father will be angry." I said, "Probably." She said, "And Pruitt." I said I'd handle Pruitt. She was quiet again for a long time. I could feel her breathing. After a while, she leaned back, just slightly. Not much, barely enough to notice, and rested against my chest. And I felt that more than I should have, more than made sense for a chief riding one of his people home in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything about it. We got back to camp an hour before sunrise. I took her to her father's lodge first, which was the right thing to do. Tall Crane came out when he heard us, wrapped in a blanket, his face not fully awake, and then suddenly very awake when he saw who was with me. He looked at his daughter. He looked at me. He looked at his daughter again. I said I would explain in the morning. I said she was tired. I said to give her some food and let her sleep. He stood there for a moment with his face doing several things at once, and then he stepped back and let her in. I took my horse to the picket line and unsaddled her and rubbed her down in the dark. My breath was making clouds in the air. My hands were stiff with cold by the time I was done. I went back to my lodge and lay down without taking off my coat, and I stared at the smoke hole again. And this time, there was no stars because the clouds had come in. I thought about what I had done. I thought about Wikapi's face when she had seen me come through that door. I thought about her saying, "Just that?" I slept a little. Not much. Tall Crane came to me the next morning, and we had the kind of conversation that 2 men have when there has been a thing done that cannot be undone, and both of them know it. He was angry in the way that fathers get angry when their plans are overturned by someone with more authority than them, which is an anger that has shame mixed into it and comes out sideways. He said I had no right. I said a chief has the right to protect his people. He said an arrangement had been made. I said I would send Pruitt his horses, 2 good horses, and the arrangement would be settled. He said that wasn't the point. I waited. He said, "What do you want with her?" I looked at him for a long moment. I said I didn't want anything with her. I said I had ridden out in the night because she is one of ours, and because Pruitt is what Pruitt is, and because I was not willing to leave one of ours in that situation. I said this plainly. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, carefully, "She is not a child." I said, "I know that." He looked at me with something that might have been measuring, and then he went away, and I didn't know what to make of the conversation except that it had changed something. Some arrangement between us that was not about Pruitt at all. The days after that were strange. Wikapi was back in her father's lodge, and I saw her the way you see people in a camp, at the water, at the fire, moving through the space between lodges. We did not speak about what had happened. There was something careful between us, something that hadn't been there before. About a week after I'd brought her back, she left a bundle of something outside my lodge in the morning. Dried berries, I think. Something wrapped in a piece of cloth. I stood there and looked at it for a while, and then I picked it up and went inside. A few days after that, I went past where she was working. She was scraping a hide, working hard at it, not looking up, and I stopped without meaning to and said something about the weather, which was a stupid thing to say, but it was what came out. She looked up and almost smiled, not quite, but almost, and she said something back about the cold coming early. And we stood there for a moment talking about nothing in that way that people sometimes talk about nothing when they are really talking about something else. I walked away from that and sat with it for a long time. My wife had been gone 4 years. I said that before. What I had not said, what I had not let myself say even in my own thinking, was that I was lonely. Not the ordinary kind of lonely that a man gets on a long trail or a cold night, the kind that has settled in and become part of the structure, become the bones of your daily life. I was a chief. I had responsibilities and demands on my time and people who needed me at all hours. I was never alone, but I was lonely in a way that none of that touched. I knew that now. One morning in December she came to me, not to my fire, to my lodge, where I was working on a piece of tack that had broken, sitting inside in the warmth. She stood at the entrance and said, my name, my real name, not the trader's name. And she said it the right way, which told me her Lakota was better than most people in camp knew. And I said, come in. She came in and sat across from me, and for a moment she just looked at her hands. Then she looked up. She said, I want to talk about why you came to get me. I said I had already told her. She said, you said I was one of your people. And I said just that. And you didn't answer. I looked at the piece of tack in my hands. I set it down. I said, what do you want me to say? She said, I want you to say the true thing. There are moments in a life when a person asks you for the true thing, and you have to decide whether you are going to give it to them. It is harder than it sounds. The true thing is not always comfortable, and it is not always what people expect, and sometimes saying it out loud makes it real in a way you were not ready for. I sat there for a long moment. Then I said, I saw your face at the creek. When you knew about Pruitt. I saw what it cost you, and I could not. I sat with it for days, and I could not make peace with it. She was watching me. I said, I don't know if that's more than a chief's duty. I don't know if that's something else. I know what it felt like to ride out there in the dark, and I know that it did not feel like duty. She was very still. I said, you asked me to say the true thing. That is the true thing. She let out a breath that was slow and long, and she looked at her hands again. And when she looked up, there was something in her face that was different from anything I had seen there before. Not the calculation I had seen at the creek. Not the carefulness from the days after. Something more open. something that cost her something to show. She said, "I thought about you on the ride to Pruitt's camp. I thought about you. And I told myself I was just frightened, and I was reaching for something steady, but it wasn't that." She stopped. Then she said, "When I saw you come through that door, I thought I knew it was going to be you." We sat in that for a while. The fire was small but warm. Outside the camp sounds went on: children, dogs, someone splitting wood, and in here, it was quiet. The way a lodge can be quiet, even when the world is loud outside. I reached across and took her hand. Just that. Just her hand in mine. And I held it, and she let me. And we sat there for a long time, without talking. That was the beginning of it. There was still tall Crane to deal with. I went to him on a clear day in January, when the cold was hard, and the snow had been on the ground for a month and wasn't going anywhere. I brought tobacco. I sat down at his fire and we went through the courtesies, which are their own language, and then I told him what I was asking. He looked at me with that same measuring look. He said, "You are the chief." I said, "Yes, and I am asking, not telling." He thought about that. He poked at the fire with a stick. He said, "She is not a child." I said, "I know." He said, "She is the one you need to ask." I said, "I already asked her." He looked at me sharply. I said, "She asked me to ask you." He sat there for a moment. Then he laughed, not a loud laugh, but a real one, something genuine. And he shook his head and looked at the fire. He said, "She told you to come here." I said, "She did." He laughed again, quietly. He said, "She has always done things in the right order, even when she was small. She would figure out the right order of a thing, and then do it that way. I used to watch her and think that one is going to be trouble for someone." He smiled at the fire. He said, "Apparently, it is you." I said I supposed it was. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "She was not happy about Pruitt." I knew she was not happy. But winter was coming, and he stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "A father does not always do right. Sometimes, he does what he can see and misses what he cannot." I didn't say anything. He said, "You will be good to her." It was not a question, but I answered it like it was. I said, "Yes." He nodded once. He said, "Then, we are agreed." We were married in February, on a day when the snow came down soft, and the light was that gray-white color that makes everything look like it's behind a curtain. Her mother wove a blanket with patterns in red and brown. My oldest friend in camp, a man called Elk Runner, stood up and said things about me that were generous and probably more than I deserved. And several people laughed at the right moments, and Wakapi stood beside me in her good clothes with her hair done the way her mother had done it. And I looked at her and thought, I am not sure what I did to deserve to be standing here. That is the thing about being given something freely, something that was not taken but offered. You are always a little unsure you've earned it. Maybe that's the right way to feel. Maybe that keeps you from taking it for granted. After, when the celebrating was done and people had gone back to their fires and the snow was still coming down, we sat in my lodge, our lodge, and she leaned against me the way she had on the horse that night. That slight pressure, and I put my arm around her and held her. She said, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She tilted her head back and looked at me. And her eyes were steady and warm, and she was not performing anything, not trying to be anything. She was just there, just present, just a woman who had chosen to be here, freely, and that was the whole thing. That was everything. I want to tell you about a morning in April, because I think it is the right place to end. We had made it through winter. The camp had made it through, which is never guaranteed, and the horses had made it through, and the old ones and the children had made it through, and there had been sickness in January, but we had gotten through that too. The river was running high with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods along the bank were starting to go green, and the smell of the air was different, that wet earth smell that you don't realize you've been missing until it comes back. I was outside my lodge before sunrise, which is when I tend to be up. The world was that dark blue color before the light comes. The camp was quiet. Somewhere on the other side of the ridge, a bird I hadn't heard in months made its sound. And I stood there and listened to it. And I felt something that I don't have a simple word for, in any language, some combination of gratitude and steadiness, some sense of the ground under your feet being real. I heard the lodge door behind me, and then she was there beside me, wrapped in the red blanket her mother had woven. She had just woken up, her hair loose, her eyes still soft with sleep. And she came and stood next to me and looked at the same dark blue sky. She said nothing. I said nothing. After a while, she put her head against my shoulder. Just that, just her head on my shoulder in the cold morning. And I put my arm around her and pulled her close. And we stood there and watched the light come. It came the way it always does. Slowly first, and then all at once. The hills going from black to gray to the color of old copper, and the birds still going somewhere in the trees, and the camp starting to stir, and the river making its sound. I have been responsible for a great many people in my life. I have made decisions that cost things, and I have sat with losses that you don't fully set down. And I have been in enough places where everything could go wrong, that I know what it feels like when things go right. This was the right way to begin a day. This was the right way to begin what came after. She squeezed my arm once, and I held her tighter, and the sun came up over the eastern hills, and the red blanket around her was the brightest thing in the whole valley. I did not need anyone to tell me what I had. I knew what I had. I had known it since February, since January, since the night I rode east through the dark with nothing but a rifle and the certainty that I was not going to leave one of mine behind. I was valued. I was needed. I was the man she had turned toward when everything else fell away. The man she had chosen when she could have gone anywhere, could have adapted to Pruitt's life, the way women sometimes do when there is no other choice, and built a wall between herself and what she felt. She had not done that. She had waited. She had trusted something she didn't fully understand. And when I had come through that door, she had known. That is not a small thing. That is maybe the biggest thing a man can be given. Not because he deserved it, not because he earned it by being something grand, but because he was who he was, consistent and steadfast and honest about what he could not live with. And she had seen it, and she had stayed. I held her in the April morning, and I thought about my wife who was gone. And I thought about the 4 years of going on. And I thought about the night I had saddled the gray in the dark and ridden east without telling anyone. And I thought about the calculation on her face at the creek. I thought, that calculation is finished now. She is not surviving anything. And neither am I. The sun was all the way up by then, and the camp was alive. And somewhere a child was laughing at something, and my horse was making her morning noises at the picket line, and Wikapi was warm against my side. I stood there and let all of it be exactly what it was. That is the whole story. That is all of it. I am not going to tell you it was easy, because nothing worth anything is easy. And I am not going to tell you that every day since has been the April morning, because life does not work that way. There are hard days. There are days when the old grief comes up and sits with you at breakfast. There are days when the work of leading is more weight than you think you can carry. But she is there. She has always been there, since that first February, steady and present and real. I think that is what I was missing in those 4 years. Not the idea of a woman, not the relief of someone to share the cold with. I was missing someone who chose to be there, specifically there, next to this particular man, with clear eyes and her own will. She chose me. You understand what I mean when I say that. She could have stayed with Pruitt. She could have made her peace with it and built the walls women build and lived her life on the other side of them. There is no dishonor in that. Survival is survival. but she hadn't done it. Something in her had held out, and when I had come through that door, she had let herself know it, that the thing she had held out for was this. I try not to forget that, on the hard days especially. I try to remember what it cost her to trust that, and what it meant that she gave it to me anyway, and what a man owes a woman who gives him a thing like that. He owes her everything he has. He owes her the best he can be. I am not always that, but I am trying to be, and she knows I am trying. She knows it the way she has always known things, quietly and certainly, without needing to make a thing of it. That is enough. That is more than enough. The sun is up. The horse needs water. There is work to do. I am a chief of my people, and I am someone's husband, and both of those things are real, and both of them mean something. Go on. Get up. Go on.